My name is Harold Winters, and I am a man in my early 50s, and I used to think that by this age the world had already shown me all the different ways a heart can break, but I learned on that cold afternoon that life still had one more twist waiting for me. I remember sitting in the front seat of my old car, with the heater barely keeping my hands warm. My daughter Emma had asked me for a ride to a quiet neighborhood on the far side of town. The sky above was a heavy sheet of gray, and the air felt almost frozen. You know that feeling when the wind holds still and the world seems to be waiting for something. That was the kind of cold that sat in the air that day. It made the houses on that street look older, and the trees that leaned over the road looked like they were guarding some secret they did not want anyone to discover. When Emma turned to me, her face carried a mix of worry and something else, something she was trying hard to hide. She told me to stay in the car and that she would only be gone for a minute. Her voice felt tight, like she had practiced that line in her head before saying it. She stepped out and shut the door with a soft thud, and I watched her walk toward a small house with faded paint and a porch that slanted slightly to one side. She walked quick and steady, yet the way her shoulders tightened made my stomach twist. It felt like I had seen that posture somewhere before, like someone bracing themselves for something they did not want to face. She disappeared inside the house, and the door closed behind her. For a moment, the silence in the car felt too thick. I sat there telling myself to trust her, telling myself she was an adult, and that I had no business worrying like she was still 10 years old. But a part of me, the part that had raised her, protected her, and watched her cry through life, kept whispering that something was wrong. That whisper grew louder than any logic I had. My breath hung in the cold air, and my fingers tapped against the steering wheel, even though I did not mean to do it. I leaned forward just a little, and my eyes drifted toward the front window of the house. I told myself I would look only for a second, just long enough to calm my nerves. But when I looked through that glass, I felt my whole world tilt. My heart stopped for one long painful moment before it began to pound again, like it was fighting its way out of my chest. What I saw inside that house was not confusion or something simple that could be explained away. It was betrayal shaped like a silent blow to the back. It was the kind of sight that makes your breath freeze in your throat and your thoughts scramble like they are trying to escape from your own mind. I felt the weight of years fall on me all at once. Every memory, every word, every promise cracked open inside my head. I sat there unable to move, unable to blink, feeling like I had been pushed out of my own life. That single glance inside that house through that thin piece of glass turned an ordinary afternoon into the day that changed the way I understood trust, loyalty, family, and myself. I am telling this story now not to hurt anyone, but because truth deserves to breathe even when people you love try to lock it away. On that cold afternoon, I thought I was only giving my daughter a simple ride. I never imagined I would end up staring at something that would break the world I thought I knew. I was born in a small working town where folks believed that a person was only as good as their word, and that belief shaped me before I even knew how hard the world could be. I grew up watching men shake hands on their front porches and settle disagreements with nothing but their voice and their honor. I carried that lesson like a stone in my pocket, heavy and steady, and always reminding me who I needed to be. By the time I reached my early 50s, I had lived through enough to understand loss and the slow grind of years that teach you what matters and what does not. I had lived through quiet heartbreak, through nights that felt longer than the sky, and through mornings where I felt the weight of starting over. The only thing that never broke was the bond between me and my daughter Emily. She was the one bright light that never faded no matter how hard life pushed against us. Emily came into this world with a stubborn streak and a soft heart hidden under all that grit. She was a mother's child, and my responsibility after her mother walked away when Emily was barely 5. That day carved a cold, hollow place inside both of us, yet it also forced me to become everything she needed. I took on any work I could find, fixing old heating units, hauling heavy parts, cleaning out sheds, and doing whatever else kept a roof above our heads. Every night, no matter how tired I was, I checked her homework, listened to her dreams, and made sure she knew she mattered. She grew into a woman who cared for people in a way that could soften the hardest person in the room. She talked about becoming a nurse one day, and I believed she would because her heart was strong enough to carry that kind of responsibility. I trusted her completely, And that is why the strange tension in her voice on that day stood out to me like a sudden shadow across the road. Emily never hid things from me, or so I believed. She never used that tight, stretched voice unless something serious pressed against her chest. We had always been a team, just the two of us leaning on each other through every season of our lives. But in the weeks before that cold afternoon, she had grown quieter. She came home late and sat on the couch with a tired look in her eyes, the kind of tired that came from carrying something she did not want to share. I had asked her if she was all right, and she had smiled with that small thin smile people use when they are trying to hide pain. She said she was fine, and I had let it go because I wanted to trust her timing. A father's heart, though, knows the truth, even when his mind tries to look away. I still remember the morning when I first sensed the turn coming, even though I did not understand it at the time. I had woken early to make pancakes the way she liked them, with a little extra sweetness in the batter. She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around her cup of coffee, yet she did not drink it. She stared straight ahead like her thoughts were drifting far away from the kitchen. When I asked what she was thinking about, she told me she had some things to take care of and that everything would make sense soon. She said the words gently, but I felt her distance like a cold draft in the room. I wanted to push her to talk, but I held my silence, believing that she would come to me when she was ready. I never realized that my silence would become the door through which betrayal entered our lives. Now, as I sat alone in the car outside that old house on that gray afternoon, those weeks of strange moments came back to me in a clear line. Each late night, each distant look, each forced smile, each quiet pause. It was as if my mind finally connected all the pieces I had tried to ignore. Something had been kept from me, something deep, something heavy, something that had pushed my daughter to shield me with a lie. The question now pressed against my chest like a locked gate. From who, from what, and why? The house Emily walked into had a heavy stillness that settled over it like an old blanket, and the moment she stepped through that doorway, a strange cold crawled across my skin, as if the place itself was whispering that something was wrong. It was a plain single-level home sitting tired on its foundation, with paint peeling off in long tired strips and blinds that slumped as if they had given up long ago. Nothing about it looked dangerous, yet danger is not always loud or easy to spot. Sometimes true danger hides in quiet, forgotten places, waiting for someone to walk straight into it, without knowing what waits inside. I sat there in the car, gripping the steering wheel, as though the old leather could tell me what was happening beyond those walls. My heartbeat thudded in a slow and heavy rhythm, like it was trying to warn me over and over that I should not have let her go alone into a place that felt so wrong. I tried to calm myself with simple explanations, yet none of them fit the strange, uneasy tone she had used before stepping out of the car. Maybe she was dropping something off, maybe she was helping someone from her work, maybe it was something simple, but those thoughts felt thin and weak like paper trying to cover a fire. I kept my eyes on the front door and waited for any movement, yet the minutes dragged by thick and slow, and that cold, tight feeling inside me only grew heavier. The air inside the car felt stiff, and the silence pressed against me harder than the cold outside. I leaned forward, and that was when I noticed a thin strip of light poking through the blinds of a small window on the left side of the house. The light was faint, yet enough for me to see shifting shadows inside. One shadow stood out, a broad figure that moved with a slow, controlled step. A man standing too close to my daughter. I felt my breath hitch in my chest as I stared through that thin strip of light, trying to understand exactly what I was seeing. Emily stepped back from him with her shoulders slightly raised, the way people do when they are trying to steady themselves. I could not hear any sound through the thick walls, but the shape of her body told me everything she could not say. She was not comfortable. She was not relaxed. Something was wrong. Very wrong. My heart hit the inside of my chest with a force that almost made me open the car door. The instinct of a father rose like a flame, and I reached for the handle, ready to run into that house and pull her out of whatever mess she had stepped into. Yet right as I tightened my grip on the handle, I froze. Emily lifted her hand just a little, not toward the man, but in a way that looked like she was telling someone to wait. It was small and quick, but I saw it. She spoke words I could not hear, but the shape of her mouth showed she was explaining something. The man pointed at something on the table near them, and Emily looked down at it, then looked back up at him. A tense pressure filled my skull, like a storm gathering behind my eyes. Every part of me wanted to burst into that house and shut down whatever was happening. Yet some part of me, some quiet voice buried deep inside my gut, kept me in place. Something about her movements, about her posture, about the tension in her face told me she was not trying to save herself. She was trying to protect me. And that truth hit me with a force that almost bent me in half. Why would my daughter need to shield me from whatever was happening with a man inside a plain, forgotten-looking house? A question lodged itself inside my mind, like a nail being driven in slow and sure. I watched as she reached into her bag and pulled out a small folder. She placed it gently on the table, then stepped away from it, as if distancing herself from something she did not want to touch anymore. The man leaned down to open it, and even through the window, I could see the way he carried himself, with a heavy sense of control and authority, and something else that felt like power. A power that belonged to the kind of people you do not want your child dealing with. The kind of people who do not fade out of your life once they have stepped into it, but instead leave shadows long after they are gone. I sat frozen, staring at every shift, every movement, every slow turn of a head. The whole scene felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's nightmare through a thin veil. My pulse thundered in my ears, and every muscle in my body felt wound tight enough to snap. Then Emily turned slightly, just enough for me to see her face, and what I saw nearly tore the breath from my chest. Her eyes were not simply afraid. They were holding something deeper: guilt, hurt, conflict. A pain she had tried to keep hidden from me for far too long. And it hit me in that moment that the daughter I thought I knew had been walking through something dark without me for longer than I had noticed. That realization shifted something inside me. It was like a line had been drawn without my knowledge, separating the life I thought she lived from the life she was actually dealing with. I was no longer a father simply waiting in a car. I felt like a man standing at the edge of two different worlds, realizing he had been left in the dark, while his only child carried a burden she never should have carried alone. When Emily stepped out of that house, about 15 minutes later, she looked like the weight of the whole world had been set on her shoulders in the short time she had been inside. She opened the car door with hands that trembled just enough for me to notice, and she lowered herself into the seat as if even the simple act of sitting took effort she did not have left. The first thing that hit me was the way she kept her eyes fixed on her lap, refusing to meet mine, as though she feared that one look from me would crack her open. The second thing was her breathing, which came in uneven waves, like she had swallowed something sharp and was afraid to let it slip out. When she whispered that she was fine, the sound of her voice carried the kind of weakness that told me nothing about her was fine at all. I wanted to pull her close and hold her the way I used to when she was small, but I stayed still, because I could feel that she needed space more than she needed my arms in that moment. I asked her who the man in the house was and what business she had with him, and she told me that it was nothing for me to worry about, and those words hit me harder than anything else had that day, because for years she had trusted me with the truth, even when the truth hurt. Hearing her shut me out felt like standing on the outside of our own life. She twisted her fingers together and stared out the windshield at the empty road, as though she was searching for courage she had misplaced. She said she had made a mistake months earlier and was trying to fix it before it spun out of her control. She said the man in the house was someone who had been helping her manage it. But the way her voice shifted and hesitated told me that her story was bending and folding in on itself. So I stayed quiet and let her keep talking, because sometimes a person reveals more when you give them silence instead of pressure. She told me she had gotten close to someone she should not have at her workplace. A man who had seemed gentle and kind at first, with a way of speaking that made her feel seen after a long time of carrying her own troubles. But she said he had changed like a storm she did not see coming until she was already standing in the middle of it. She had trusted him with something important, something she had no business sharing, something he later used to corner her and push her into a situation she never wanted. She said the man in the house was trying to help her sort out the damage left behind, but the more she described it, the more I felt the wrongness in her words. Her voice carried the strain of someone who was not being helped, but handled. Someone being pulled deeper rather than lifted out. I could feel she was scared to tell me the entire truth. She kept insisting she was managing it, that she had everything under control, but she did not want me dragged into it, because she could not bear the thought of me getting hurt. That thought struck at my heart harder than anything she had said so far. What trouble was she in that made her think it could harm me? How dark did it have to be for her to turn to strangers instead of coming to the man who raised her from the time she was small? The sting I felt was not anger toward her, but a deep sadness that she believed she had to face something so heavy alone. As we drove home, she finally lifted her eyes to mine. Her gaze was tired, like she had gone too long without rest, and her voice softened as she told me that she had only kept me in the dark because she wanted to fix everything before the truth reached me. Those words rolled through my mind over and over. The truth? What truth? Why would it hurt me? And who was that man who stood with her inside that quiet, forgotten house? By the time we reached home, I knew I could not let the matter rest. I could not simply accept her soft words and hope that everything would settle on its own. Whatever she had walked into had already begun to change her, and the shadows in her eyes told me the danger was real and growing. I had spent years protecting her from storms, and I was not about to back away from this one, even if she thought she could shield me. Something had reached into her life and wrapped around her without me noticing. And no matter how hard the truth would be, I was going to uncover it, even if the truth tore apart every belief I had about the people around us, even if it pulled me into a place where betrayal waited like a quiet trap. That day was not just the start of her confession, it was the start of my awakening, and the slow, painful unraveling of a world I thought I understood. At night, sleep refused to come to me, no matter how many times I turned my pillow over searching for the cool side. No matter how long I stared at the ceiling, hoping exhaustion would pull me under. I lay there listening to the soft hum of the heater kicking on and off, that steady mechanical sigh that usually comforted me, but tonight felt like a reminder of how loud silence becomes when your mind is running wild. Every small creak of the old house felt heavier than it should have, like the walls themselves knew something was wrong and was shifting uncomfortably around me. And through all of it, all I could see was Emily's face from earlier that day, her eyes wide and wet, her lips trembling with words she couldn't bring herself to say, her body tense like she was standing between me and a storm she had no way of stopping. I kept seeing that stranger's silhouette behind her, that man in the house who didn't belong in her world, yet somehow had a place in it. His presence clung to my thoughts like thick smoke. I tried to breathe past it, but the image kept returning, sharper every time, until it wasn't just a memory, it felt like a warning carved into my chest. By the time morning came, the sky outside had turned a dull steel gray, the kind that drained the color out of everything it touched. Emily left earlier than she normally did, and I watched her through the front window as she walked to her car. There was something unmistakably rigid in the way she moved, as if she was carrying a secret so heavy it threw off her balance. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, wanting to stop her, to make her turn around, to ask her outright what she had gotten mixed up in. But she didn't look back. She just got in her car and drove away with her shoulders still tight, and the moment she disappeared around the bend, I felt that same pull inside me, the one that had made me lean forward in the car yesterday. It wasn't curiosity, it was instinct. A voice that whispered quietly but firmly that this was no time to sit still or pretend everything was fine. Something had already broken, and pretending wouldn't fix it. So I got dressed, pulled on my jacket, grabbed the old leather notebook I always kept for problem solving, and headed out. The air outside bit at my face the moment I stepped out, cold enough to sting but not enough to stop me. I climbed into my truck, turned the ignition, and drove toward that forgotten-looking house. The closer I got, the heavier the sky seemed to press down, as if even the weather didn't want me going there. But I kept driving. I couldn't turn back now. When I parked down the street and stepped out, the neighborhood was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt abandoned, watched, waiting. A few cars sat parked along the road like they had been left there for weeks. The house itself stood with an eerie stillness, almost like it was holding secrets behind its thin walls. I walked toward it slowly, my boots crunching the frost-coated ground, the brittle sound echoing through the cold air. I felt like an intruder, like someone stepping across a line he wasn't supposed to cross. But the thought of Emily walking into that house alone pushed me forward. The closer I got, the more details jumped out at me. The lock on the front door had fresh scratches around it, thin sharp marks like someone had jammed a tool inside with more force than understanding. Not the work of a professional, not the casual wear of an old lock. It was the kind of damage made by someone impatient or desperate. My stomach tightened because that meant someone else had been trying to get inside. or trying to get out. I backed up a little and glanced toward the window where I had seen the shadows the day before. The blinds were half open now, tilted just enough to expose part of the room inside. Through that narrow opening I saw a table littered with scattered papers, the kind of mess that doesn't come from someone working, it comes from someone searching. And sitting on top of those papers was a small folder. The same folder Emily had carried inside with her. My pulse thudded in my ears. I knew I couldn't just stand there breathing in cold air and doubts, so I walked around the side of the house, my steps slow and guarded. I found a thin path pressed beside the siding, leading toward the back, where an old metal gate leaned crooked against the fence. The gate groaned when I pushed it open, the sound slicing through the stillness. The backyard was small and untended, patches of dead grass and dirt stretching toward a weathered shed that looked like a stiff wind could knock it down. And that was when I saw them, footprints. Fresh ones, pressed deep into the soft dirt, heading straight toward the shed. My breath caught. I followed the prints, my heartbeat growing heavier with each step, and when I reached the shed I paused, feeling the weight of what might be behind the door pressing against me. I placed my hand on the worn wood and pushed gently. The door creaked open with a slow, resisting moan, revealing a dim, cluttered interior filled with tools, boxes, and the stale smell of dust and neglect. But none of that mattered, because my eyes locked instantly on something near the floor, a torn piece of paper pinned beneath a heavy toolbox. I crouched down, reached for it, and the moment I flipped it over my whole body went cold. My daughter's name was written on it. Not printed, not casual, written. Her name, on a torn scrap hidden inside a locked shed behind a house she should have stayed miles away from. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just trouble. This wasn't some bad decision she could talk her way out of. Someone had been keeping things about her, tracking her, monitoring her. Someone had a hold on her, and whatever it was, Emily had been trying desperately to fix it alone. That realization hit me with such force that I had to steady myself with a hand on the shelf beside me. This was bigger than I had imagined. Darker, sharper around the edges. I scanned the ripped lines on the paper, trying to piece together meaning from the fragments. Names cut in half, dates missing endings, words smudged. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me one thing. This was only the first thread of something tangled, something that had already begun wrapping itself around my daughter's life, and if I didn't tear it apart, it would swallow her whole. I folded the paper with shaking fingers and slipped it into my pocket. As I stood there in that dim shed, a vow formed inside me with the kind of strength that only comes when a father realizes the ground beneath his family is crumbling. I would not let Emily walk through this darkness alone. Whatever she was tangled in, whatever danger she thought she had to shoulder by herself, I would face it with her, even if it cost me my peace, even if it cost me every truth I once believed. When I finally stepped out of the yard and back toward my truck, my chest felt tight but burning with something fierce. A fire that had only just been lit. I was no longer just a father worrying for his daughter. I was a man stepping onto a battlefield he never prepared for, and I knew, deep in the marrow of my bones, that the first blow had already been struck, and it had been struck at my family. I drove home from that shed with a heaviness that didn't just sit on my chest. It pressed into my ribs, into my lungs, into the space behind my heart, where old fears settle and begin to move again, after years of silence, and the torn paper with my daughter's name on it felt like it was burning a hole straight through my pocket. I kept touching it, as if my fingers could pull more meaning from it, as if holding onto it tightly enough would force the truth to reveal itself. But all it did was pulse, there like a quiet threat. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the sight of the old oak tree greeted me. The same tree that had watched Emily learn to ride her first bike. The same tree she had once tied ribbons to during summer storms so she could pretend she was sending messages to the sky. And yet now even that old tree seemed to stand differently, its branches still, its shadow stretched across the yard like it was trying to warn me that something dark had begun to seep into our lives. I sat there in the truck, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to gather my thoughts, but everything inside me felt twisted and raw. I couldn't stay outside forever, though, because the truth was waiting for me inside, sitting on my table, sitting in my pocket, sitting in the hollow space between what I knew and what I feared. Inside the house the air felt denser, like the walls were holding their breath, and I pulled the torn paper from my pocket and placed it on the table with the kind of care a man gives to something fragile and dangerous at the same time. I smoothed it out with the flat of my palm and stared at the half message that remained. The markings were sharp and deliberate, the handwriting tight like the writer had wanted to make sure every stroke meant something. There were fragments of times, small notations of places, tiny scribbles that seemed innocent until you realized what they truly meant. It was a record, a tracking sheet. Someone had been monitoring my daughter, following her patterns, her movements, her schedule, and seeing her name written there, separated from her, as if she were an object someone was cataloging, sent a cold shiver crawling slowly up my spine. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't some mix-up involving a coworker with petty motives. This was someone with intent, someone with reason, someone who believed they had a claim to her in some way I could not yet understand. I sat heavily in my chair, leaning forward with my elbows pressed to my knees, as I tried to think with the clarity of a man who had lived enough life to recognize trouble before it showed its full face. I thought of the coworker Emily had mentioned once, the man who had betrayed her trust at work, who had twisted her vulnerability into something he could use for his advantage. Maybe this was his doing. Maybe he had started something she couldn't end. But the man I saw in the house didn't feel like some office rat-chasing influence or spite. He had stood like someone who commanded rooms, like someone who knew leverage, like someone who had something to offer people who had very little left to lose. I replayed his silhouette in my mind, the way he didn't move quickly, the way he didn't hide, the way he seemed almost bored with danger. That was not a co-worker. That was someone who lived at the edge of lines most people never even get close to. I was still staring at the torn paper when a knock shattered the silence. 3 taps, slow, steady, intentional, not the impatient knock of a neighbor, not the friendly knock of someone familiar, the kind of knock that announces itself before the person even speaks. I hesitated for a moment, a tight unease forming in my gut before I finally opened the door. And there he was, a man standing on my porch, tall, broad-shouldered, with a gray-threaded beard that didn't soften his appearance but sharpened it. His face was calm, but his eyes told another story. They were the eyes of someone who had witnessed things that chipped pieces away from a man's soul, and yet he looked at me with the indifference of someone who didn't intend to be understood. He introduced himself in a steady, almost practiced tone, claiming he worked with the city, saying he was looking into recent reports of unusual activity in the area. But as he spoke, his eyes didn't stay on me. They drifted behind me, scanning the inside of my house, analyzing, searching, memorizing. That was when I knew he wasn't a city worker. He wasn't checking on the neighborhood. He was fishing. He was watching for reactions. He was looking for confirmation of something he already suspected. He asked me directly if I had seen anything unusual near the old house off Pine Ridge Road, speaking the name of the street so casually yet so deliberately that it felt like he was testing the air for tension. And in that moment, I felt something inside me harden. I kept my answers short, flat, harmless. I told him I hadn't seen anything worth noting. The truth hung heavy behind my words, but I kept my face still. His eyes narrowed by a fraction, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for a man who has survived his share of storms to understand that something had shifted in his mind. He asked then, in a tone that tried to sound routine but failed miserably, whether anyone in my family had visited that house. My stomach tightened, my jaw clenched, but my head shook in a calm, steady motion. I lied to him with the ease of a father protecting his own blood. He held my gaze for a long moment, studying me like a man who was used to reading truths between breaths, and then finally gave a slow nod, the kind that didn't feel like agreement. It felt like acknowledgement, like he had just filed away a new piece of information. When he stepped back from my door and told me to report anything strange, his voice carried a weight that didn't match his words. It wasn't a request. It was a warning wrapped in a threat, wrapped in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And when he finally turned and walked away, his footsteps were steady, unhurried, confident, the footsteps of a man who wasn't afraid of being followed. After I locked the door, I leaned my back against it, letting the tension drain from my body only enough to allow me to breathe again. His presence lingered in my house like leftover smoke from a fire that someone thought had been extinguished, but still smoldered under the surface. I could feel that man's shadow stretching through my living room, wrapping itself around the corners, settling into the spaces between my thoughts. That man wasn't from the city. He wasn't doing a routine check. He was connected to the house, connected to the man Emily met, connected to the secrets she was trying so desperately to keep from me. And if he had come to my doorstep, then the danger wasn't approaching, it had already arrived. As night settled in again, the wind began to rise outside, rustling the branches of the old oak tree, making them scrape softly against the window like a quiet reminder that the world outside was shifting. I stood there in the dim light of my living room and realized something terrifying and painfully clear. If strangers were showing up at my door, asking careful questions, pretending to be something they weren't, then Emily wasn't just involved in something dangerous. She was surrounded by it, wrapped in it, possibly drowning in it, and she had no idea how deep the roots had grown. I knew then with absolute certainty that I couldn't wait for her to come clean. I couldn't sit back and hope she would trust me enough to talk. The threat had already reached my home. It had already stepped onto my porch. It had already looked me in the eye. And whether Emily wanted me involved or not no longer mattered, because the moment the tall man knocked on my door, I became part of this darkness, whether I was ready for it or not. The next morning came with a grey kind of light, the kind that slips through the curtains without bringing warmth, the kind that makes everything in the house feel still and uncertain. I woke early and moved quietly through the hallway, listening for the soft shuffle of Emily getting ready for her shift at the clinic. When she finally came down the stairs, her steps were slow and careful, almost like she was trying not to disturb something fragile inside her. She poured herself coffee, and even from where I stood hidden in the dimness of the hallway, I could see the tremor in her hands, a small, betraying shake she tried to hide by holding the mug tighter. She didn't see me watching her. She didn't see the worry building in my chest, like a storm gathering strength. She simply sipped the coffee, stared out the window for a long moment, as if searching for an answer in the pale morning sky, then grabbed her bag and left with a tiredness that didn't belong on someone her age. I waited until the sound of her car faded from the driveway, until the silence in the house stretched long enough to feel like it was staring back at me. And then I finally moved to the kitchen table and sat down with my hands clasped together like a man preparing himself for a truth he didn't want but couldn't avoid. I thought about everything we had lived through together, every scraped knee I cleaned, every night I stayed awake by her side when the world felt too big for her, every moment she had reached for me with complete trust. And now there was something sitting between us like a wall, something she was carrying alone, something that scared her enough to lie to me, something that had already dragged strangers to my doorstep and left shadows in the corners of her room. It wasn't distrust that pushed me to do what I did next. It was desperation, the kind that only comes when a father senses that danger is circling his child, slow and deliberate, waiting for the right moment to strike. A father doesn't sit back when he knows his child is drowning in something she can't speak about. A father steps into the dark, even if he has no map. And so I rose from the table and walked toward her bedroom. The moment I opened her door, I felt like I was stepping into a part of her life she had never intended for me to see. The room was clean, soft, gentle, small traces of childhood mixed with the responsibilities of adulthood. Photos, little notes, a blanket she'd had since high school folded neatly at the foot of her bed. It was a place that had always reflected her heart, warm, caring, full of quiet strength. But today, as I stepped slowly inside, it felt different. It felt like a room that held secrets in its corners, like a place where someone had cried in silence. I moved carefully, almost reverently, because even though I knew searching through her things crossed a line, I also knew I couldn't stand by while the truth stayed buried and danger kept breathing down her neck. I started with her desk, a small wooden piece she had bought with her first paycheck. I opened the drawers gently, sifting through papers, receipts, pens worn down from long hours. Then buried beneath a stack of clinic schedules and nursing notes, I found a small notebook. The moment my fingers touched it, something in my chest tightened. It looked ordinary, just a worn, dark cover with the edges frayed. But the moment I lifted it and felt its weight, I knew this was not something she wanted found. I sat on the edge of her bed, opened it carefully, and began to read. Her handwriting rushed across the pages, uneven and hurried, as if her fear had pushed the pen faster than her thoughts could settle. I saw dates, places, times, short scribbled notes that looked like reminders, warnings, confessions, and then I saw a name repeated so often it felt like it had been carved into the pages. Rowan, not the coworker she had mentioned, not a name I had ever heard from her lips, not someone who should have had this kind of presence in her life. Each time the name appeared, it was paired with words that made my blood run colder. Persistent, unpredictable, refuses to let go, said I owe him, threatens to escalate. As I read deeper, the picture sharpened into something far worse than a messy relationship or a workplace mistake. This Rowan wasn't someone she simply trusted at the wrong time. He was someone who had stepped into her life slowly, quietly, and then wrapped himself around her choices like a tightening rope. The entries grew darker the further I read. She wrote about late-night meetings she hadn't wanted to attend, about messages he sent when she tried to distance herself, about promises he made that turned into leverage. She confessed in writing what she couldn't bring herself to say aloud, that she had tried to pull away, but every time she tried, he pulled her back harder. She wrote about feeling cornered, trapped, like she was making decisions with someone's hand around her throat. And then came the part that shattered me. She wrote that she needed someone to intervene, someone strong enough to break the cycle, but she specifically wrote that she didn't want that someone to be me. She said she couldn't bear the thought of me getting hurt because of her mistakes. She said she had already lost too much in life and she wouldn't be able to survive losing me too. Those words hit me like a blow. For all the lies she had told, all the secrecy she had built, all the distance she had created between us, I finally understood the reason behind it. She wasn't shutting me out because she didn't trust me. She was shutting me out because she loved me, because she believed she was protecting me, because she thought whatever danger she was caught in would swallow me whole if she let me get too close. And yet what she didn't understand, what she could never fully grasp, was that a father who has carried his child's fears since the day she first looked into his eyes does not remain on the outside when darkness comes for her. Love doesn't step back. It steps forward, even into the fire. Then I came to a line that made everything else fade away, a line written with such pressure the ink had bled through the page. Rowan took something from me, something he said he would use if I walked away. I stared at those words until the edges of the room blurred. I didn't know what he had taken, money, documents, something personal, something dangerous. But whatever it was, it held her in place. It chained her to him. And that chain was the reason she had lied. The reason she had gone to that house. The reason she was trembling every morning like someone waiting for the next blow. I closed the notebook, holding it between my hands like it was a piece of her suffering made real, and I felt the shift inside me turn from fear into something colder, steadier, sharper. Resolve. A kind of resolve that settles in a man's bones and refuses to move. I was no longer a father lost in confusion. I was no longer a worried parent hoping the truth would eventually come out. I was a man who had seen the blueprint of the trap, built around his daughter. And I was a man preparing to break that trap apart piece by piece, even if I had to step into the shadows to do it. Because whatever lies had started all this, whatever fear had driven her choices, whatever power Rowan held over her, none of it mattered anymore. He had crossed a line the moment he put fear into my daughter's heart, and I was going to make sure he regretted ever learning her name. Later that evening, when Emily finally walked through the front door, the house itself seemed to recoil from the tension she carried with her. I heard her keys jingle in her hand, a small sound, but somehow sharp enough to slice through the quiet, like a warning bell. I greeted her the same way I always did, my voice steady, casual, pretending I had spent the entire day patching up little things around the house, washing dishes, repairing that loose cabinet hinge. But inside my heartbeat was thundering, like a drum out of rhythm. I watched her with a kind of helpless desperation, noticing things no normal father should be forced to notice about his own daughter. The way her shoulders twitched at the smallest sounds, the way she avoided meeting my eyes, the way she kept wiping her palms on her jeans, as though trying to get rid of something that clung to her skin. She checked her phone so often it looked like she was afraid it might disappear if she didn't look at it every few seconds. The space between us felt like thick, unmoving fog, the kind that makes you wonder if something terrible is hiding inside it. During dinner I tried to ease her into conversation, asking her how work was going, how the new interns were doing, whether the clinic had gotten the shipment of supplies they'd been waiting on. At the moment the question left my mouth, her spoon froze halfway to her lips. The tiny pause felt like a stone thrown into a still lake. You don't think it matters, but the ripples spread out forever. Her answers came short, clipped, almost rehearsed. She didn't look up from her plate. She chewed slowly, as if every bite was something she had to fight her way through. I felt myself studying her the way a soldier watches a battlefield, ready for danger, ready for clues, ready for the moment everything breaks open. But I didn't push her. Sometimes pushing someone you love is just another way of pushing them further from you, and I could not bear the thought of her drifting out of my reach. At night when she went to her room, I heard it, that quiet broken sound that twists a parent's heart into knots. She was crying. Soft, muffled, the way someone cries when they're terrified of being heard. I stood outside her door with my hand hovering over the knob, fingers trembling. I remembered the days when she was small and would run to me whenever something frightened her. Back then she didn't hesitate, she just believed I would fix whatever was wrong. But now she was behind that door, crying alone, thinking she had to protect me from something I still didn't understand. My hands slowly fell away. I didn't open the door. I stayed in the hallway, leaning against the wall, listening to my daughter's pain, feeling it like a weight pressing on my chest, until I could hardly breathe. The next morning the world shifted. She was dressed for work, her hair tied back in a messy knot like she had been too tired to care. She grabbed her bag with rushed movements, ones that screamed panic even though she tried to mask them with calm. I watched her from the kitchen doorway, trying not to look like I was studying each breath she took. Then her phone buzzed, a single vibration, a tiny thing. But the way her entire body went rigid at that sound told me everything. Her face drained of color so quickly I thought she might faint. Her lips parted, as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. She grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, her movements frantic, and said she needed to take care of something important. Important. That word hit me like a blade. Important to who? To what? Important enough to send her running like her life depended on it. I didn't yell after her. I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my keys, got in my truck, and followed. Not close. Not stupidly. I stayed far enough behind that she wouldn't notice, letting the space and traffic hide me. My pulse was so loud I could feel it in my throat. She drove through town, past the familiar houses and shops, and then kept going out toward the old industrial strip, where factories used to breathe smoke into the sky before they all went bankrupt, and left behind skeleton buildings that still held onto their shadows. She pulled into an old storage lot, the kind of place where people keep things they're too afraid to throw away or too ashamed to bring home. She got out, glanced around nervously, and went into a long metal-sided building that looked like it had been standing there since before either of us were born. I parked behind a truck that looked abandoned and stepped out, leaving my engine off so the silence wouldn't betray me. The gravel crunched under my feet like broken glass. I walked slowly along the side of the building until I found a narrow gap between two rusted panels, and through that gap, I saw the moment my whole world cracked open. Emily stood inside with a man, tall, thin, sharp-looking, with the kind of eyes that could send a chill straight into a person's bones. He didn't move like a decent man. He didn't look at her like someone who cared. He looked at her like she was something he owned. That had to be Rowan, the name that haunted her notebook, the man who had forced her into secrets, the shadow in her life. He stood too close, far too close. He waved something in front of her face, a small object, something metallic or plastic. I couldn't tell from where I was, but whatever it was made her knees buckle like her strength had been ripped from her. She covered her mouth with both hands, trying not to cry, trying to keep herself from falling apart completely. The sight of her shaking like that lit a fire inside me so violent, I had to step back and lean my head against the cold metal wall to keep myself from breaking through it. Then I heard him speak. His voice was low, cruel, dripping with confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you hold someone's life in your palm. He told her that if she didn't do what he wanted next, he would send the truth to me. His exact words cut through the metal, slicing straight into my chest. Your father will know everything, everything you've been hiding, everything that will destroy the way he sees you. You think he'll still look at you the same? My knees nearly gave out. The truth, what truth could my daughter possibly believe would shatter me, make me stop loving her? That alone terrified me more than Rowan ever could. Emily shook her head over and over, begging him softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked like someone pleading for oxygen while drowning. Rowan leaned closer, his mouth near her ear, and told her she had one more task, one more thing she had to do before he'd let her go. But the way he said it made it clear he had no intention of letting her go. Not tomorrow, not next week, not ever. Men like him don't release their grip, they tighten it. Standing there in the cold shadow of that metal building, watching my daughter tremble, hearing her fear in every word she tried not to say, something changed inside me. The confusion was gone. The hesitation was gone. I didn't care what the truth was, whether it was dark, shameful, heartbreaking, or complicated. I didn't care what mistakes she thought she'd made. I didn't care what he was holding over her head. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever the truth was, I would face it. And I would face Rowan too, not as a frightened father peering through a crack in a wall, but as a man who had finally seen the monster threatening his child and was ready to bring that monster to the ground. When I returned home that day, I walked through my own front door as if I was stepping into someone else's life. Nothing felt familiar anymore. The walls that had once held laughter now felt like giant, hollow ribs around a heart that had stopped beating. Every chair, every photo frame, every quiet corner carried an uneasiness I could not shake. My home was no longer a safe place. It was the quiet before a storm, the still air before lightning splits the world open. I sat at the kitchen table, the place where Emily and I had eaten dinner countless times, and I stared at everything I had gathered so far. The torn slips of paper from her notebook, the scribbled names, the dates, the repeated name Rowan, the shape of a threat, a pattern that was forming like a bruise spreading under skin. The truth was still scattered, still hiding behind shadows and fear, but I could feel it slowly stitching itself together. Rowan had something on my daughter, something sharp, something cruel. Something powerful enough to make her tremble at the sound of a phone notification. Something that could make my brave, stubborn, strong-willed girl kneel to his demands. And then there was that other man, the broad figure in the abandoned house, someone who wasn't just involved but comfortable, practiced, moving around in that space, as though he had done this kind of thing before. Maybe he was Rowan's partner. Maybe he was someone higher up. Maybe he was someone even worse. I closed my eyes and saw her face again, the fear, the trembling, the silent begging. It replayed in my mind like a cruel film over and over until something inside me hardened. There is a kind of moment in a father's life when love turns into resolve, when fear turns into fury, when worry sharpens into strategy. That moment came to me like a cold breath against the back of my neck. I opened my eyes and knew exactly what I had to do. I had to build a plan, not a desperate one, not a reckless one, not the kind of half-made attempt that ends with good men broken. I needed clarity. I needed information. I needed to understand every inch of the nightmare Emily had fallen into. And then I needed to dismantle every piece of it until Rowan had nothing left to stand on. The first step was to return to that abandoned house, the place where I had seen the broad figure through the window, the place where Emily had been betrayed without even knowing it. This time I approached differently, more carefully. I parked 2 blocks away near a stand of bare winter trees and walked through them silently, letting the branches scratch against my jacket like long fingers trying to warm me back. I stayed hidden behind brush and old fences, watching the windows, watching the door, watching the shadows inside shift like something breathing. 30 minutes passed, long, slow, suffocating minutes, before the front door opened. The same broad figure stepped out. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't look around in confusion. He looked like a man expecting trouble, a man who had enemies. His head moved side to side slowly, his eyes scanning the street like he knew danger could be anywhere. Then he locked the door carefully, pulled his hood up, and walked down the road until he disappeared around the corner. I felt the timing pulse through me like a heartbeat. This was my moment. I moved fast but quietly, stepping over debris, hugging the shadows until I reached the back door. My fingers hesitated just 1 second before I tried the handle. To my shock, it clicked and gave. It was unlocked. That alone told me these men were reckless, confident to the point of arrogance. Inside, the air was colder than outside, stale and thick, like no one had bothered to open a window in years. Dust floated in the dim light. The floorboards creaked under my weight, each sound like a warning that I was stepping deeper into danger. The room felt like a place where bad intentions were stored, where ugly secrets gained shape. A wooden table sat in the center of the room, covered in scattered papers. I approached it slowly, scanning the mess. Some papers were maps, hand-drawn, folded, marked with circles and arrows. Some were lists of locations, and then I found the list of names. My eyes moved down the list until they froze on the one name written in red marker, Emily Winters. My daughter. Next to her name, someone had written a note, short and sharp like a blade, across the page. She still owes one more piece. My jaw clenched so tight I could feel nerves screaming in my temple. One more piece. What piece? What had she given already? What had they taken? I forced myself to breathe. Anger was clawing at me, begging to take over, but anger blinds men, and blind men don't save their children, they die trying. I searched deeper, sliding papers aside, checking under boxes and old broken equipment. Then I found a second folder thicker than the rest. My hands shook only once before I opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, and when I saw them something cold and wrong washed over me. These weren't dangerous photos, they weren't humiliating. They weren't the kind of pictures shame is built from, but they were private, personal, stolen. Pictures of Emily walking out of work. Pictures of her sitting in her car eating lunch. Pictures of her carrying groceries. Pictures of her leaving our neighborhood. Different times of day. Different angles, some taken from far away, others close, too close. They had been watching her, logging her, tracking her every step like predators studying prey. These photos didn't expose a mistake she made. They exposed a threat she lived under. My hands gripped the folder as I kept flipping through. That's when I found it, a small folded receipt taped to the back of one of the pages. I peeled it off carefully. On the back was handwriting, jagged, rash, unsettling. It read, "Rowan will deliver final demand soon." Final demand, the words crawled under my skin. Rowan had been tightening a rope around her, countdown ticking, waiting for the last turn of the knot. Whatever he was planning, it was close. Close enough that he was giving instructions. Close enough that Emily was running out of time. I felt myself gripping the table, my knuckles turning white, but I forced myself to calm down. Rage is a wildfire, fast, distractive and blinding. But focus is a blade, and I needed a blade more than fire. I set everything back carefully, making sure nothing looked disturbed. Then I slipped out the back door and walked through the trees again, the cold air hitting my face like a warning that time was no longer on my side. By the time I reached my truck, I knew what had to be done. I couldn't wait for Rowan to make his final demand, because when he did, Emily would fold under the weight of it, not because she was weak, but because she was exhausted, terrified, trapped. I had to get ahead of him. I had to find out what he had taken from her, what he was using to control her, and I had to make sure that whatever it was would no longer be a weapon in his hands. That night, as the world grew dark outside my windows, and the house settled into a quiet that felt heavier than sleep, the plan finally took shape inside me, slow, deliberate, dangerous, born from fear, but sharpened by love. I was no longer waiting for truth. I was hunting it. 2 days passed like slow poison moving through my veins. Each morning I pretended things were normal, and each night the truth that I had uncovered sat heavy in the back of my mind, like a stone I could not swallow. I moved through the house quietly, thinking, planning, watching Emily with new eyes. She looked more fragile than I had ever seen her. She jumped when the phone vibrated. She barely slept. And every time she walked past me, there was this flicker in her expression. The flicker of someone hiding a wound they could not bandage on their own. And then, on the evening of the second day, everything that had been building finally collapsed into the moment I had both dreaded and expected. I was sitting in the living room, the notebook she had been hiding lying open on the coffee table in front of me. The lamp cast a small circle of light over the pages, making the scribbled lines and frantic handwriting look even more desperate. I was reading through it, for what felt like the 100th time, when I heard the soft click of her bedroom door opening. Emily stepped into the hallway slowly, her footsteps barely touching the floor, and when she came around the corner into the living room, she froze. The instant her eyes landed on the notebook in front of me, everything inside her stopped. She didn't even breathe, her shoulders locked in place, her face drained of color, her hands hung limp by her sides as though someone had cut the strings holding her up. She stood there in the doorway like a child about to be scolded, but what I saw in her eyes was not guilt, it was fear. A deep, bone-soaking fear that made my chest tighten. She asked if I had gone through her things. Her voice was barely a whisper, and it wavered like someone standing at the edge of a cliff. I didn't lie to her, I didn't soften it. I told her yes, I had. I told her I had read the notes, the dates, the names, the patterns she had been trying so hard to hide. I told her I had been afraid for her. I told her I could not sit quietly, or something dangerous wrapped itself around her life. The moment I said it, her whole body crumpled. She sank down onto the couch like her legs could no longer hold her weight. She buried her face in her hands, and her shoulders began to shake. The sound of her crying filled the room, not loud sobs, but soft, broken breaths that no parent ever wants to hear from their child. I sat beside her slowly, giving her space, giving her breath, giving her time. And then she began to talk. Her voice trembled like she was afraid the truth itself might hurt me. She told me everything, not in a clean, organized confession, but in pieces, in fragments, like someone digging through rubble to find what was left. She said that Rowan had been charming at first, a listener, someone who made her feel seen during a time when work had worn her down. She said he had offered help, advice, support, the kind that feels safe at first, until you realize it was only bait. She trusted him quickly, too quickly, and in a moment of pressure and poor judgment, she gave him temporary access to a work account. A small thing, she thought, a harmless favor, a way to help with a volunteer project he claimed to be part of. She had believed him. But Rowan had used that access to pull sensitive internal information from the clinic. Information he was never supposed to see. Information that didn't hurt patients, but still violated protocols. Enough to get her fired. Enough to get her blacklisted from her field. Enough to shadow her entire future if it ever came to light. She told me her mistake had been stupid, reckless, careless, and she blamed herself more than anyone else ever could. At the moment Rowan got what he wanted, he became someone else. Someone colder, someone sharper, someone who smiled when she panicked. She said he threatened to expose everything unless she did what he asked. At first it was small tasks, drop off a package, deliver a message, pass along information. Things that didn't make sense but didn't feel dangerous at first. Then slowly, the tasks grew heavier, more secretive, more in the shadows. And then she told me the part that tore something deep inside me. She said Rowan had threatened me, not just her. He told her that if she refused him, he would ruin her reputation and mine. He told her he'd make sure I lost respect in the community, that he'd paint her as a criminal and drag my name beside hers. She had been carrying that fear alone, believing she was shielding me from the fallout, believing she had to suffer quietly to protect me. She said she couldn't let people think I raised a dishonest daughter. She said she couldn't bear the thought of me looking at her differently. That was the moment something inside me cracked open. Not from anger, not from betrayal, but from heartbreak. She thought she had to protect me. She thought my love for her was fragile enough to break over a mistake. She thought I would abandon her because of one wrong decision. I reached for her hands and held them tightly between mine. Her fingers were ice cold. I told her she was wrong. I told her nothing she could ever do would erase the years I spent raising her, laughing with her, getting her, loving her. I told her I would walk through hell with her before I ever looked at her with shame. She collapsed into me, crying into my shoulder like she had done when she was little, burying herself in the only place she had ever truly been safe. We stayed like that for a long time. Just a father and his daughter, trying to stitch together a trust that Rowan had tried to tear apart. Then her phone buzzed. A sound cut through the room like a blade. Emily stiffened instantly. She reached for the phone with shaking hands, looked at the screen, and went pale. Her breathing changed, sharp, shallow, frightened. She handed the phone to me without saying a word, as if even reading the message out loud might make it more real. The message was from Rowan. The final task is ready. You have 1 hour. Come alone. If you don't, everything goes to your boss and your father. Those words were the spark that lit the fuse, the line we could not back away from. Rowan was demanding the last piece, the last obedience, the last surrender, and he wanted her to walk into a remote warehouse outside town, a place no one would notice, a place no one would hear her scream. I stood up, no hesitation, no fear, only resolve. I told her she was not going alone. I told her I had already stepped too far into this storm to turn back now. I told her that fathers do not stand in the light while their children walk into darkness. I told her we would face Rowan together. She begged me not to come. She said it was too dangerous. She said Rowan might hurt me. I took her face gently in my hands and told her that nothing, not fear, not threats, not danger, would stop me from standing with her. I told her she had carried this alone for too long. Tonight, she wouldn't. Tonight, the storm would face me instead. The drive to the warehouse felt like moving through the last thin layer of daylight before the world tipped into something darker. The sun had already begun its slow sink behind the hills, and everything outside the windshield had turned the color of old steel, Cold, muted, waiting. My hands held the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart, knuckles white, fingers stiff, every turn of the road tightening the knot in my chest. Emily sat beside me, her breathing unsteady, her shoulders pulled in as though she were trying to fold herself into a place where none of this existed. I kept telling her it was going to be all right, even though the truth was that I had no idea what waited for us in the fading light ahead. Fathers aren't supposed to doubt. We tell our children everything will be okay because sometimes the lie is the only comfort we can give. The warehouse was a lonely thing sitting far off the main road, surrounded by tall dry grass that whispered and rattled in the cold wind, like voices of people who had seen too much and said too little. The gravel beneath the tires crackled as I pulled off the road and parked at a distance. The building looked abandoned, but a faint glow flickered through the metal slats, and something about the way the shadows moved inside made the air feel thinner. I turned to Emily and told her to stay in the truck until I checked things out. Her lips parted, a protest trembling in her breath, but she stopped herself. Fear glistened in her eyes, but so did something else, trust. She nodded once, small and fragile, and I stepped out into the freezing air that sliced through my jacket like it had been waiting. The gravel crunched under my boots as I moved toward the side of the building, keeping low, letting the wind hide the sound of my steps. Through a crack in the rusted metal wall, I caught sight of Rowan. He was packing in a small lit space near the front of the warehouse, an envelope in one hand, his phone in the other. He looked nervous, impatient like a man expecting disaster, but still believing he was smart enough to outrun it. He kept checking the door, the phone, the envelope, then back again. And every time he paused, I could almost feel the trap he had planned tightening around us. I leaned closer, pressing my ear near the slit in the wall, the cold metal stinging my skin. And then I heard his voice, low and sharp and soaked in cruelty. He said that after tonight he wouldn't need Emily anymore, that the files he had taken from her workplace were already sold, already out in the world, already earning him whatever twisted sense of victory he had been chasing. He said she was nothing but a loose end, something to tie off and discard when the job was done. That word, loose ends, slithered into my chest like ice water. My daughter, my gentle, loyal, hard-working daughter, reduced to a disposable threat by a man who enjoyed watching fear swallow people whole. Anger doesn't describe what rose inside me. It was older than anger, something forged from every sleepless night, every unanswered question, every moment I saw her flinch at shadows she didn't think I noticed. I turned to go back to the truck, but before I took more than 3 steps, another movement caught my eye through a different window, nearer to the front of the warehouse. The sight nearly took my legs out from under me. The broad figure from that first house, the one I had only seen through the glass on that cold afternoon, stood inside with another envelope in his hand. He and Rowan were arguing, their voices sharp and escalating. I pressed closer, listening, barely breathing. The broad man said the deal was off. He said Emily had done enough, that this had gone too far, that dragging her deeper would bring heat none of them could survive. But Rowan didn't care. He didn't want the information anymore. He wanted the control, the fear, the thrill of watching her tremble. He said he liked seeing her break. Hearing those words, I felt something in me crack open. A kind of silent fury poured through me, steady and cold. Not rage that blinds you, but rage that sharpens you. I returned to the truck, pulling the door open. Emily's eyes widened when she saw my face. She asked what I had seen, and I told her everything: Rowan's threats, the other man's regret, the plan to cut her loose. Her entire body tightened, her breath hitched, but then she did something I had not expected. She straightened her back, wiped her eyes, and nodded with a calmness that didn't belong to fear but to survival. For the first time in weeks, I saw the fire in her, the one Rowan had tried to smother. We walked toward the warehouse door step by slow step. The grass swayed against our legs, and every crunch of gravel echoed like a warning. But just as we reached the entrance, the door swung open. Rowan stood there with a smirk carved across his face, smug and sure of himself, holding the envelope like a weapon he believed could keep her chained forever. He thought she had come alone. He thought she was still broken. He didn't expect me. I moved in front of my daughter without a second thought, standing so close to Rowan that the coldness in his eyes met the fire in mine. I told him that whatever he had, whatever he thought he controlled, whatever power he had been clinging to was gone now, because I knew everything, every threat, every manipulation, every lie. And I wasn't afraid of him. His smirk faltered, cracking at the edges like a mask made of cheap paint. Before he could spew another threat, the broad man stepped out behind him. But instead of siding with Rowan, he tossed his envelope to the ground, the paper fluttering like a broken promise. He told Rowan he was done. He said he had joined him to protect someone he cared about, not to watch innocent people suffer. His voice trembled not from fear but from shame. Rowan turned on him enraged, but the man walked away into the night, leaving Rowan shouting after him, alone, exposed, powerless. Emily stepped forward then, her voice steady and fierce in a way I had never heard before. She told Rowan she was done being afraid. She told him she was reporting everything, the stolen files, the threats, the tracking, the manipulation. Rowan tried one last time to intimidate her, but the sound came out thin and hollow. Fear slipped from his grasp the second he realized she was no longer standing in the dark by herself. I watched the moment he understood that whatever game he thought he was winning was over. As Rowan retreated into the warehouse, his voice echoing empty threats he no longer had the strength to carry out, I guided Emily back to the truck. She was shaking, but it was the kind of shaking that comes after surviving the storm, not before. We drove straight to the authorities. She told them everything with the kind of raw honesty that makes people listen. I added what I had seen, what I had heard, what I had pieced together in silence. The notebook, the recordings, the timelines, the messages, every strand Rowan had woven into his trap became the rope that bound him. 2 days later, he was in custody, his smirk replaced with the hollow stare of a man who had finally run out of shadows to hide in. At night, for the first time in months, Emily slept without waking up gasping, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like the father she believed I was, not perfect, not fearless, but present and unbroken. The window I looked through on that cold afternoon months earlier, the one that showed me her pain through the glass, had destroyed something in me. But it also saved her, because sometimes the truth doesn't just hurt. Sometimes it becomes the only thing that leads you back to the people you love. The moral of this story stretches far beyond the choices of a father and his daughter, and reaches into the quiet corners of every life where trust lives, where silence grows, where love tries to protect itself even when protection turns into damage. In the end, this story reminds us that trust is not made of stone or steel, but of something far more fragile, something that can crack under pressure and crumble under neglect. Even the people we love the most, the ones we believe would never cross certain lines, can sometimes take advantage of the silence we keep, mistaking our patience for permission and our quietness for blind acceptance. It shows us that staying quiet to avoid conflict is not kindness. It is the slow surrender of our own peace, a surrender that gives power to those who choose dishonesty over integrity. Silence becomes a room where lies grow comfortable, where manipulation finds a home, where fear learns to walk on 2 legs. Real strength does not live in the heart that keeps everything buried. It lives in the moment we decide to step out of the shadows of our own fears and speak the truth, even when the truth shakes the foundation we stand on. Telling the truth is not about winning or proving something. It is about reclaiming the pieces of ourselves we lose every time we choose to endure something that breaks us. And when honesty finally rises, even if it rises trembling, it becomes the beginning of a rescue. Sometimes the rescue of a relationship, sometimes the rescue of a soul, sometimes the rescue of a life we didn't realize was slipping through our fingers. This story also teaches us that respect does not come packaged in age, titles, or the roles we believe we are entitled to. Respect is built slowly, brick by brick, through actions, through consistency, through choices that show our loyalty is not conditional. A parent does not automatically earn respect because of parenthood. A partner does not deserve trust simply because they share a roof. A child does not lose value because they made a mistake. Actions decide everything. And when actions turn corrupt, when someone uses power to exploit vulnerability, respect dissolves like paper in water. Families stay together not through secrets, not through avoidance, not through pretending everything is fine when hearts are bleeding beneath the surface. Families stay together through the hard, uncomfortable, vulnerable work of being honest, through admitting mistakes before they become weapons, through facing problems before they turn into monsters, through holding each other accountable with love instead of fear. Hiding the truth to avoid hurting someone's feelings may seem compassionate, but in the long run, it only plants seeds that grow into distance, resentment, and sorrow. There is no protection in secrecy, only delay. Sometimes the toughest moments, the ones that rip through us like a storm we never saw coming, end up being the ones that save us. They force us to stop, to look, to confront, to tear down the illusions we wrapped around ourselves. They push us to see what we tried to ignore for too long. Pain, as unwelcome as it is, becomes the light that exposes what needed to be faced. And betrayal, sharp, unexpected, unforgettable, can be the very thing that pushes us to rebuild with stronger walls, clearer boundaries, and a deeper understanding of who deserves space in our lives. And though betrayal cuts deep, it also teaches. It teaches us who we are when the floor gives way. It teaches us to value our instincts when something feels wrong. It teaches us that loyalty must be mutual, not demanded, not coerced, not expected out of fear. It teaches us that self-respect is not a luxury, but a necessity, a guardrail that protects us from being dragged into someone else's shadows. Betrayal becomes the thread that leads us out of the maze, showing us which doors should never be opened again and which paths lead toward healing. In the end, the moral of this story is not about the downfall of one man or the suffering of one daughter. It is about the universal truth that trust is a fragile gift that must be handled with honesty. It is about understanding that silence is not peace if it costs us our dignity. It is about learning that the bravest thing we can do is stand up for ourselves, even when we are afraid. It is about realizing that love cannot survive where deceit thrives. And it is about embracing the painful but powerful truth that sometimes we must break the silence, confront the betrayal, and walk through the storm so we can reach the life waiting on the other side. One built on clarity, strength, and the kind of loyalty that does not crumble when tested.